The boy sat completely still at the end of a long banquet table, his hands folded neatly in his lap, a graduation cake untouched in front of him, while 112 people laughed and clinked glasses, and pretended not to notice he was there. His name was Eli, he was 14 years old, and the ceremony had been organized entirely in his honor. Gold balloons spelled out congratulations along the far wall of the rented hall in Oakville, Ontario. A catered spread covered 2 side tables, sandwiches, cheese platters, petit fours from a bakery downtown. A string quartet played near the entrance. There were speeches prepared. There was a slideshow. There was a framed certificate from the school board, presented that morning, acknowledging Eli's completion of his modified academic program. A milestone that had taken 4 years longer than his peers, and cost his father more in private therapy and adaptive tutoring than he would ever admit to anyone. The hall was full of adults Eli did not know. Colleagues from his father's law firm. Partners from the senior table. Clients who had been invited because declining would have been awkward. A city councilor who had gone to university with Eli's father and who spent most of the evening near the bar. 2 cousins who checked their phones. An aunt who had driven from Hamilton and immediately stationed herself beside the dessert table, as though protecting it. Children had not been invited. There was no one Eli's age in the room. His father, Theodore Hargrove, stood near the front entrance greeting guests as they arrived, shaking hands with the ease of a man who had spent 30 years doing exactly this. He was 51 years old, silver-templed, broad-shouldered, and one of the most recognized names in family law in the Greater Toronto Area. He had argued cases before the Court of Appeal. He had been profiled in Canadian Lawyer magazine. He had won things: settlements, precedents, custody battles for parents who had no one else left to call. What he had not won, in 4 years of trying, was the ability to make his son feel at ease in a room full of people. Theodore kept glancing across the hall toward Eli. Each time he looked, the scene was the same. Eli sitting still. Eli watching the string quartet with an expression that revealed nothing. Eli's hands in his lap, exactly where they had been when they arrived. Theodore told himself this was fine. He told himself the evening was going well. He told himself that Eli was okay. He had been telling himself variations of this for 4 years. Eli was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, 2 months after his 10th birthday, though the signs had been present long before anyone named them. Theodore had been slow to accept the diagnosis, not because he disbelieved it, but because acceptance meant reorienting everything. He thought he understood about his son's future. He had imagined certain things: a son who would one day articulate arguments across a dinner table, a son who might, someday, sit beside him in a courtroom. These were not cruel expectations. They were simply the blueprints a man builds in his mind before life hands him different materials. His wife, Caroline, had been more instinctive about Eli from the beginning. She had understood, before anyone used clinical language, that Eli processed the world differently. That sound was louder to him than to others, that crowds drained something from him that took days to refill. That routine was not stubbornness but survival. She had been the one who researched therapists, who built the visual schedules, who learned which fabrics Eli could tolerate against his skin, and which ones sent him spiraling before school. Then, 22 months after the diagnosis, Caroline was killed by a driver who ran a red light on Dundas Street West, on a Tuesday afternoon in January. The collision was witnessed by 6 people. The driver was 23 years old. Caroline died before the ambulance arrived. Theodore did not take a leave from work. He did not know how to grieve openly, and so he did not. He arranged the funeral with the same precision he brought to it state litigation. He thanked people for coming. He filed the insurance claim. He hired a full-time support worker for Eli, a part-time housekeeper, and a grief counselor he never actually saw himself. He redistributed his hours and returned to the office. People called this resilience. Theodore was not sure what to call it. What he was sure of, in the months and years that followed, was that he was doing everything he could. He found the best occupational therapist in Halton region. He enrolled Eli in a specialized program at a school in Burlington. He bought noise-canceling headphones for every environment: the car, the house, the waiting rooms. He researched adaptive curricula. He attended every meeting, signed every document, wrote the checks without looking at the totals. He was present in every way he knew how to be present. And he was failing his son in the ways that are hardest to name. The evening of the graduation celebration was supposed to be different. Theodore had organized it to mark something real. Eli's completion of a 4-year modified secondary program, his acceptance into a supported transitional arts program at Sheridan College beginning in September. These were not small things. These were things that had required from Eli more effort per day than most people exert in a week. Theodore had wanted to honor that. He had simply organized the honor in a way that had nothing to do with his son. The string quartet finished a movement. Eli did not clap with the others. He turned slightly in his wheelchair. He had used one since a secondary spinal compression issue, identified 2 years earlier, had made walking for long periods painful, and looked at the cake again. It was a white fondant cake with a blue astronomical pattern across the top, because Theodore had remembered that Eli liked space. He had ordered it from a specialty bakery. He had paid extra for the detail work. Eli looked at it for a moment, then looked away. He was not crying. He did not cry often in public, because public crying required a kind of emotional processing that became difficult when everything else in the environment was also asking for his attention. The acoustics of the hall, the smell of the catering, the specific pitch of the string quartet's instruments, the way the gold balloons shifted when the door opened and let in cold October air. He was not crying, but he was somewhere far from the room, in the way that children go somewhere far from rooms when the rooms are not built for them. It was the building superintendent who noticed first. His name was Kevin Lapointe, and he was 58 years old, and he had not been invited to the celebration. He worked out of a small office on the ground floor of the event venue, a converted heritage building near the lake that housed 2 banquet halls and a small cafe. Kevin's job involved boilers and booking calendars, and the kind of building maintenance that keeps everything running, while remaining entirely invisible to the people inside. He had come upstairs to check on a reported issue with the ventilation system in the secondary hall, and had paused in the doorway of the main room to confirm. The caterers hadn't blocked the emergency access panel again. That was when he saw Eli. Kevin had a son of his own, 31 years old now, living in Sudbury, working as an electrician. But Kevin had also spent 3 years as a volunteer coach for a youth-adapted hockey program in Mississauga, back when his son was playing, back before everything got busy, and the years compressed the way years do. He had spent those 3 years learning to read a room through different eyes. Learning which kid in the lineup was having a sensory bad day. Learning that sometimes you don't ask "Are you okay?" because the question itself is too loud. Learning that sometimes you just sit down nearby and talk about something ordinary, until the world gets a little quieter. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the boy at the end of the banquet table. The untouched cake, the folded hands, the particular quality of stillness that is not peace but exhaustion. Kevin thought about going back downstairs. He had no business at this event. He was wearing his work clothes. Gray canvas trousers, a navy jacket with the building logo on the chest. He was not the kind of man who inserted himself into situations that weren't his. Then he thought about the adapted hockey program, about a kid named Marcus, who used to sit exactly like that on the bench, perfectly still, watching everything, waiting for it to be over, until someone sat beside him and asked about his favorite planet. Kevin walked across the hall toward Eli's table. He pulled out the chair beside the boy and sat down, not across from him, beside him, so they were both facing the same direction, looking out at the same room. He did not make eye contact immediately. He looked at the astronomical cake. "That's a good-looking rendition of the Orion Nebula," he said. Eli did not respond right away. But he looked at the cake. "The real one's about 1,344 light-years away," Kevin added, as though this were simply a fact worth mentioning. "You can see it without a telescope on a clear night. Most people don't know that." There was a pause. Then Eli said very quietly, 1,344 is the most commonly cited estimate. Some sources put it at 1,350. Huh, Kevin said, like he was genuinely considering this. "I stand corrected." Another pause. Eli's hands, still folded in his lap, shifted slightly. "It's loud in here," Eli said. "Yeah," Kevin agreed. "It is. These old buildings don't absorb sound well. Stone and plaster, everything bounces." Ellie looked at him for the first time. "You know about acoustics?" "A bit. I manage this building. I spend a lot of time thinking about what sound does to a space." Ellie considered this. The string quartet is using a cello that's slightly out of tune, the A string. It's been bothering me since they started. Kevin listened for a moment. I think you're right, he said, I wouldn't have caught that. What happened next was small. It was the smallest possible thing. Kevin Lapointe did not transform the evening, he did not fix anything or announce anything or make a speech. He simply stayed. He asked Eli about the Sheridan program, what courses were offered, whether there was an astronomy component, whether Eli had looked into the campus observatory. He let Eli talk, and he listened without redirecting, without checking his phone, without the particular expression adults wear when they are waiting for a child to finish speaking. Eli talked about the observatory. He talked about a documentary had recently watched about the James Webb Space Telescope. He talked about light pollution in Oakville and how, on the clearest nights from his bedroom window, you could still sometimes see Cassiopeia if you waited long enough. Kevin listened to all of it. At some point, neither of them marked the exact moment. Eli reached forward and cut himself a piece of the cake. Theodore saw it happen from across the room. He had been mid-sentence with a partner from the firm's litigation group, and then he simply stopped talking. The partner said something he did not hear. Theodore was watching a man in a navy work jacket and canvas trousers sitting beside his son, and his son was eating cake, and his son's posture was different from what it had been all evening. Eli was not relaxed exactly. Eli was never what most people would call relaxed in a crowded room. But he was present. He was in the conversation. He was somewhere other than far away. Theodore had not seen his son look like this, engaged, animated, leaning slightly forward, in longer than he wanted to admit. The partner beside him said something again. Theodore excused himself. He crossed the hall slowly, unsure of what to do with what he was feeling. It was not a simple emotion. It was the compound kind. The kind that arrives when you realize you have been solving the wrong problem for a very long time. He had organized caterers and string quartets and specialty cakes with accurate nebula patterns. He had been solving for excellence. He had not been solving for Eli. He stopped a few feet from the table and listened. Eli was explaining something about the classification of dwarf galaxies. The man in the work jacket was asking a follow-up question, and the question was good. It was specific, it was curious, it was not condescending, and Eli answered it at length. Theodore stood there long enough that it became awkward to keep standing. He pulled out a chair and sat down on Eli's other side. Eli looked at him with mild surprise, then returned to his explanation. Theodore listened. He did not interject, he did not check the time, he did not think about the guests on the other side of the room. He sat in the chair beside his son and he listened to the specific classification systems of dwarf galaxies, until he understood, roughly, what a spheroidal dwarf was, and why it differed from an irregular dwarf, and why this distinction apparently mattered. It was, he realized, the first time in months that he had sat beside Eli without an agenda. The party did not transform. The string quartet played on, the guests continued their conversations. The man from the city council eventually left early, shaking Theodore's hand on the way out. None of the dynamics of the evening restructured themselves around Eli, because that is not how rooms full of adults work. But something happened at that table. Kevin Lapointe eventually mentioned that there was a viewing platform on the roof of the building, accessible, unused tonight, visible to the street but not to the hall, where, on clear evenings, you could see a reasonable slice of sky. He had been up there once in the autumn and seen more stars than he expected, this close to the lake. Eli looked at Theodore, Theodore looked at his son. 20 minutes later, the three of them were on the roof, in the October cold, and Eli had his phone out with a star mapping application active. And Kevin had borrowed someone's coat from the cloakroom, and was pointing at a smisser of light near the eastern horizon that might, Eli confirmed after a moment of analysis, be the edge of the Andromeda galaxy. 2.5 million light-years away, Eli said, the most distant object visible to the naked eye. Kevin whistled low and quiet. Theodore looked up at it for a long time. In the weeks that followed, Theodore Hargrove began to change. Not in the ways visible to the people at his firm, but in the ways that eventually matter more than those. He started leaving the office earlier on Thursdays. He started sitting in the living room with Eli after dinner, instead of returning to his laptop. He started asking about dwarf galaxies and Webb telescope images and the specific orbital mechanics of objects in the Kuiper belt. Not because he understood them, but because asking led to Eli talking, and Eli talking was the closest thing to his son being fully present that Theodore had found. He also stopped organizing events for Eli that were actually events for other people. This was harder to admit than it sounds. Theodore had spent years believing that excellence was love, that the right school, the right therapist, the right cake, the right venue, was equivalent to being there. He had confused provision with presence. He had treated his son's needs as a project to be managed, rather than a life to be shared. He did not become a different man overnight. He remained in many ways the same private, controlled, overscheduled person he had always been. But something had shifted in the architecture of his priorities, and once it shifted, it did not shift back. He also, eventually, called Kevin Lapointe. He had gotten the number from the venue's reception desk and sat with it in his phone for 10 days before dialing. He said thank you. Kevin said it was nothing. Theodore said it was not nothing, and Kevin was quiet for a moment, and then said he understood, and they talked for a while about the roof, and about the Andromeda Galaxy, and about a boy who had needed, more than anything else that evening, someone willing to sit beside him and ask about something that mattered to him. Kevin mentioned, in passing, that he still volunteered occasionally with an adaptive recreation program through the Mississauga Parks Department. Theodore said he hadn't known those programs existed in this region. Kevin said most people didn't. The following month, Theodore's firm made its first charitable contribution to the Halton Adapted Sports Foundation. The amount was significant. Theodore's assistant asked whether to include it in the year-end communications to clients. He said no, some things don't need to be announced. Eli began his program at Sheridan College in September. On his first day, Theodore drove him to the campus and helped carry his supplies inside. He did not shake hands with the program coordinator and immediately talk about the firm. He did not network. He helped Eli set up his workspace, and when Eli was settled and did not need anything else, Theodore stood in the doorway for a moment. He said, "I want to hear about the observatory, when you go." Eli said he would report back on the light pollution situation. Theodore said that sounded good. He drove home along the lakeshore, past the event venue near the water, past the building that had a roof where, on a clear October night, you could sometimes see the edge of a galaxy, 2.5 million light-years away. He thought about a man in a navy jacket, who had sat beside a boy he didn't know, and asked about a nebula on a cake. He thought about how small the gesture had been, how specific, how entirely without performance. He thought about all the times he had tried to love his son at scale, the specialty cakes, the framed certificates, the rented halls, and how many of those times Eli had sat somewhere far away, waiting for it to be over. You can fill a room with everything money can provide, and leave the most important space completely empty. Theodore knew this now in a way that could not be unknown. His son had not needed a ceremony. He had needed someone to sit beside him and speak his language. The drive home took 40 minutes. Theodore did not listen to the radio. He thought about Caroline, and what she had always understood, that he had taken so long to learn. He thought about Eli on the roof, phone in hand, pointing at a smear of light near the horizon, and saying, with complete certainty, that it was there, that something 2.5 million light-years away was visible. If you stood in the right place and took the time to look. He thought about what it might mean to finally be in the right place. And he kept driving north, toward home, where his son would be back in a few hours with things to tell him, if he was ready to listen.